It was the night of December 23, 1964, in the Mekong Delta of South Vietnam, at a small Special Forces outpost called Tan Yen. A handful of American Green Berets and their South Vietnamese soldiers were pressed into the mud, and they were losing. What had started as scattered, harassing fire had grown into something far worse. Viet Cong fighters were closing in through the dark, the way they always did after sundown. They understood the rhythm of this war better than the men they were attacking. They knew that when the sun went down, the night belonged to them. The defenders did the only thing they could. They got on the radio and called for air support. And then they waited, because in the dark, waiting was usually all there was. 37 minutes later, they heard it. 2 old radial engines droning somewhere above the black tree line. It was a sound the men on that base recognized, and it did not fill them with hope. It was a flare ship, an aging twin-engine cargo plane, the same kind that had hauled supplies in the Second World War, now flying slow circles overhead and dropping parachute flares to light up the ground. The Viet Cong knew that sound too, and they had a simple answer for it. They stopped moving, they went to ground, they pressed themselves flat into the paddies and the brush, and they waited for the flares to burn out and the plane to run low and turn for home. They had done this many times before. A flare buys you only a few minutes of light. The night is patient. So were they. The flares drifted down. The ground lit up in that harsh, swinging silver glare, and the Viet Cong lay still, waiting for the darkness to return. But this plane did not leave when the flares died. Instead, out of the black sky came a sound that no soldier on either side of that fight had ever heard before. Not the crack of a rifle, not the thump of a mortar. Something else entirely. A single, tearing, mechanical roar and a solid rope of red fire pouring straight down out of the night. In moments, that orbiting aircraft put roughly 4,500 rounds into the Viet Cong positions. The attack did not slow, it broke. The men who could still move ran. One of the American crewmen in that plane later admitted the guns frightened even him. He said flame came out of the muzzles and even licked back inside the aircraft around the spent cartridge cans, and the noise of all 3 guns firing at once was overwhelming. It terrified the men firing them, and they were on the winning side. The Viet Cong reacted differently. In the months that followed, their own captured documents would order their fighters not to shoot at this thing when it appeared. "Do not fire on the dragon," the orders said. "Your weapons cannot hurt it. You will only enrage the monster." They called it a dragon. The Americans called it Puff, and soon they gave it the name that stuck. They called it Spooky. Before we go any further, I want to ask you for one small thing. This is a small, independent Cold War and military history channel, and lately the numbers have fallen off sharply. Fewer people are seeing these videos than used to. If you enjoy carefully researched history like this, the single most helpful thing you can do is simple. Subscribe. Leave a comment, even one word, and share this video with someone who would find it interesting. Every like, every comment, every share tells the algorithm to show this to new people, and that is what keeps deep history documentaries like this one alive. That is the whole ask. Now let us go back to Vietnam, and to the problem that had haunted the American war effort for years before that night over Tan Yen. Here is the problem the United States could not solve. In the villages and jungles of South Vietnam, the daytime and the nighttime were 2 entirely different wars. In daylight, American firepower ruled. Fighter jets, artillery, helicopters, spotter aircraft. If the Viet Cong tried to gather in the open under the sun, they were asking to be destroyed, and they knew it. So they did not fight in daylight, they fought at night. After dark, the guerrillas came out of the tree lines and the tunnels and the flooded fields. They surrounded isolated special forces camps, government outposts and defenseless hamlets. They dropped mortars, probed the wire, and if the defenders were weak enough, they overran the position and vanished before dawn. The jets could not help, because a fast jet screaming over pitch-black jungle at hundreds of miles per hour cannot see a target, cannot stay, and is far more likely to kill the friendly troops than the enemy. Artillery could not always reach, and even a strike that arrived could not shield a village through 8 straight hours of darkness. The night belonged to the Viet Cong, and it had for a long time. That was the strategic reality of the ground war in the early years. It was slowly bleeding South Vietnam to death, one hamlet at a time. The Americans tried to answer it with light. Old cargo planes packed with parachute flares would circle over an attack and light the ground so the defenders could see and shoot. On paper it made sense. In practice it failed, over and over, because the enemy simply waited the flares out. The light lasted only minutes. The Viet Cong had all night. So the question sitting on the desks of American commanders was brutally simple. How do you take the night away from an enemy who has built his entire war around owning it? And here is the part that is almost hard to believe. The answer to that question already existed. It had existed on paper for more than 20 years. A weapon that could hang over a village all night, light the ground with its own flares, and pour continuous, accurate fire onto attackers within yards of friendly troops. It had been proposed. It had been sketched. It had even been demonstrated. And the United States military had said no to it, again and again and again, for over 2 decades. To understand how one converted cargo plane finally broke the enemy's grip on the darkness, you first have to understand how close America came to never building it at all. Let us be honest about how bad the night problem really was. By 1963, Viet Cong activity after dark had climbed sharply. This was not random terror. It was a deliberate campaign to strangle the South Vietnamese government by making the countryside ungovernable after sunset. If a farmer in a hamlet knew the government could not protect him at night, then the government did not truly control that hamlet, no matter what a map in Saigon claimed. The American and South Vietnamese answer, for a long time, was the flare ship. These were C-47 transport planes, the military version of the famous DC-3 airliner, the workhorse cargo aircraft of the Second World War. Crews packed them with large magnesium parachute flares. When a hamlet radioed that it was under night attack, a flare ship would fly out, orbit overhead, and turn night into a flickering, shadowed day. In November of 1963 alone, these aircraft dropped more than 7,000 flares over enemy positions. And still it was not enough, because a flare ship can only show you the enemy. It cannot kill him. The Viet Cong adapted almost at once. When the flares appeared, they stopped and waited. The light would swing and drift and slowly fall, and then it would die, and the plane would eventually turn for home, low on flares or low on fuel. The moment the sky went black again, the attack picked up right where it left off. The flares gave the defenders a few minutes of hope, then took it away. In some ways that was crueler than no light at all. This is the crucial point. The illumination existed. The slow, patient, long loitering aircraft existed. What was missing was the one thing that would turn that orbiting plane from a nuisance into a nightmare. Guns. Guns that could fire continuously, straight down, onto the exact spot the flares were lighting. And the idea of putting those guns on that kind of aircraft was not new. It was old, tired, and repeatedly rejected, gathering dust in filing cabinets while men died in the dark. To find the beginning of the idea, you have to go back long before Vietnam, long before the Cold War even had a name. The whole concept rests on a simple piece of flying called a pylon turn. Picture an aircraft flying a tight, banked circle around a single fixed point on the ground, the way a racing plane circles a pylon. As long as the plane holds that circle, one spot on the ground stays pinned at the center, off the low wingtip, the entire time. Now mount a gun so it fires sideways, straight out of that low wing, toward the center of the circle. Suddenly the gun is locked onto that one spot, and it stays locked there for as long as the pilot keeps flying the turn. You never lose the target. You never have to dive, shoot, break away, and come back around. You just orbit, and you keep firing. That idea is very old. As early as the 1920s, an Army pilot named Lieutenant Fred Nelson mounted a side-firing machine gun on the wing of his biplane, flew tight pylon turns over a ground target, and scored hits. He had demonstrated the essence of the whole concept almost 40 years before it would reach a battlefield. The Army was not interested. It went nowhere. Then came the man history remembers as the true originator. In April of 1942, in the middle of the Second World War, a young coast artillery officer named First Lieutenant Gilmore MacDonald proposed something clever. He suggested fitting a small Piper Cub aircraft with a side-firing machine gun to hunt German submarines. The plane would orbit a surfaced submarine in a pylon turn and hose it with continuous fire, never having to break off and attack again. MacDonald's idea was passed over, and it sat, ignored, for nearly 20 years. But he did not give up. In 1961, now a lieutenant colonel, he revived the old proposal and presented it to a tactical air command panel, rejected again. Then, late that year, he met the right person at the right time. At Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, MacDonald crossed paths with an engineer from Bell Aerosystems named Ralph Flexman. The two men talked, and MacDonald told him a story that stuck. He described a missionary pilot in South America who delivered supplies to remote jungle villages by lowering a line while flying a tight pylon turn. The line, hanging from the circling plane, stayed almost perfectly still over one spot on the ground. If a rope could be held that steady, MacDonald argued, so could a stream of bullets. Flexman understood immediately. He became the catalyst. In late 1962, he wrote a formal proposal for a side-firing gunship and sent it up the chain, and once again it ran into a wall. Officers asked how you could possibly aim such a thing. They raised objections about the flight paths of the bullets and how far they would scatter. They doubted a slow cargo plane could ever hit anything useful. There is a bitter irony buried in all of this. The concept was not even uniquely American. Back in 1932, French engineers had already fitted a fixed-side firing 75mm cannon into a large bomber intended for use in France's colonial possessions. And one of those colonies, the place France meant to use it, was Indochina, the very ground that would one day become Vietnam. So the record is clear. The weapon to take back the night had existed, in one form or another, for more than 20 years, and the answer kept getting turned down. What finally changed was not the idea. The idea was always sound. What changed was that a few stubborn men forced the Air Force to test it at the exact moment a desperate war made it impossible to keep ignoring. The man who dragged the concept across the finish line was a test pilot named Captain Ronald Terry. History would later call him the father of the gunship, and he earned the title. In 1964, Terry returned from a temporary assignment in South Vietnam, where he had been part of a team studying how America was fighting this new kind of counterinsurgency war. He had watched the flare ships circle helplessly over night attacks. He had seen the problem with his own eyes. He had read the old proposals, and he believed the answer was sitting right in front of everyone. Just before Terry got involved, another officer had finally proven the concept worked. In August of 1964, Captain John Simons ran a program called Project Tail Chaser. Simons took a Convair C-131 transport plane and mounted a single electric Gatling gun, a minigun, to fire out the left side. To aim it, they did something almost comically simple. They drew crosshairs on the pilot's side window with a grease pencil, and it worked beautifully. Flying a steady pylon turn, a pilot could line up those grease pencil crosshairs and put fire onto a fixed target with real accuracy. The test was a success, and then, in the usual pattern, the money dried up and the tests were suspended. Terry refused to let it end there. He pushed the concept one enormous step further. Instead of one gun, he mounted 3 miniguns in the side of a C-47, the same reliable old cargo plane that was already flying all over Vietnam. 3 electric Gatling guns, each firing the standard 7.62mm rifle round, and together capable of a truly staggering rate of fire. But Terry had a problem larger than engineering. The idea had powerful enemies inside the Air Force. Many senior officers hated the thought of turning slow cargo planes into attack aircraft. Part of it was a bitter rivalry with the Army over who should provide fire support on the ground. Part of it was pride. Fast jets were the future. Old propeller transports were the past. So Terry did the only thing that would work. He went to the very top. He and a fellow officer briefed the Air Force Chief of Staff himself, General Curtis LeMay, one of the most powerful and hard-nosed airmen alive. Most of LeMay's own staff opposed the idea. LeMay overruled them and approved sending the guns to Vietnam for a real combat test. The team arrived at Bien Hoa Air Base in South Vietnam on December 2, 1964, with the equipment to convert 2 C-47s. Much of the gear was borrowed, improvised, or fabricated on the spot, which is one reason the aircraft eventually earned the nickname it did. The first converted gunship was ready on December 11, the second on December 15. They were handed to the 1st Air Commando Squadron for combat testing, and the officer who took the first one into the fight was Captain Jack Harvey. On the radio, they called it Puff, a call sign borrowed, to the songwriter's great annoyance, from a popular folk tune of the era. For the first time, the flare ship and the guns were the same airplane. For the first time, the aircraft that lit up the night could also destroy what it found there. After more than 20 years of rejected proposals, the weapon was finally over Vietnam. Within a week, it would face its first real test, on that December night over Tan Yen. But before this becomes a simple story of a miracle weapon, we have to be honest about how fragile it was at the start. Remember, this was a combat test, not a fielded program. There were only 2 of these gunships in the entire country, and one of them was soon sent back to the United States to train crews. For a stretch of time, that left exactly 1 Puff in all of Vietnam. 1 aircraft, 1 crew. If it had been shot down, or if the tests had gone badly, the skeptics who had blocked this idea for more than 20 years would have been proven right, and the whole concept could have died on the spot. And the aircraft itself was, on paper, absurdly vulnerable. It was a slow, unarmored 20-year-old cargo plane. It had to fly low and slow, in a predictable circle, over an enemy who was shooting back. A single well-aimed heavy machine gun on the ground could, in theory, tear it apart. Every officer who had opposed the program had used exactly that argument. You are going to send a fat, defenseless transport to circle low over the enemy all night. It will be a flying target. The gunship survived that weakness for one specific reason, and it is important to be accurate about it. In these early years, the Viet Cong attacking those isolated hamlets usually traveled light. They favored fast hit-and-run raids, and they rarely dragged heavy machine guns or dedicated anti-aircraft weapons to a night attack on a village. So the thing that should have made Puff a death trap, its low, slow, predictable orbit, was survivable, because the enemy in that place, at that time, mostly could not reach up and hit it hard enough. That would not stay true forever. Later in the war, against a better armed enemy with real anti-aircraft weapons, these gunships would pay a heavy price. 19 of them would ultimately be lost. But in December of 1964, over the Delta, the gamble held. The concept finally got the one thing it had never been given in all those years. It got a fair chance to prove itself in combat, and it did not waste it. Let us understand exactly what those men had and why it changed everything. The gunship flew a left-hand orbit, typically around 3,000 feet up, at a slow cruising speed. The pilot, looking down through his side window at the target pinned at the center of his circle, controlled the guns with a trigger on his own control yoke. He could fire 1 gun, 2, or all 3. A gunner in the back managed the weapons and cleared any jams. Another crewman set and dropped the flares. Now here are the numbers that made hardened men on the ground weep with relief when they heard those engines. The 3 miniguns together fired so fast that the aircraft could put at least 1 bullet into every single square yard of an area the size of a football field, in a matter of seconds. Every 5th round was a tracer, a glowing red streak, so the stream of fire looked like a single unbroken beam of light connecting the plane to the ground. That is why, from a distance, it looked exactly like a dragon breathing fire into the earth. And it did not have to do this once and leave. A fully loaded gunship carried around 45 flares and roughly 24,000 rounds of ammunition. It could loiter over a besieged hamlet for hours, dropping light and delivering fire in measured bursts, again and again, until either the ammunition ran out or the enemy was gone. Consider what that did to the entire Viet Cong strategy. For years, their advantage had been patience. Wait out the flares, wait out the jets, wait out the artillery, own the darkness, because the Americans could never stay. But you cannot wait out a weapon that stays all night, sees you the whole time, and can kill you within yards of the men you are attacking. The one resource the guerrillas had always relied on, time in the dark, was the exact resource the gunship took away. The whole equation of the night war was about to flip. It needed to be proven once, in front of everyone. And on the night of December 23, 1964, at Tan Yen, it was. We began in the middle of that night. Now you know everything that led to it, and everything that hung on it. The outpost radioed for help. 37 minutes later, Puff arrived overhead. It dropped its flares, and the Viet Cong, as always, went to ground to wait out the light. Then the pilot rolled into his pylon turn, lined up the target off his wing, and squeezed the trigger. Roughly 4,500 rounds poured down in a tearing red torrent. The attack did not fade, it broke. The fighters who could still move ran. Then something happened that had never been possible with a flare ship or a jet. The gunship was not out of fuel, and it was not out of ammunition. So when a second outpost, a place called Trung Hung, about 20 miles away, called in that it too was under attack that same night, Puff simply flew over and did it again. Same result. The attack was blunted. The enemy was driven off. 1 aircraft, 2 besieged outposts, in a single night. That was the whole point. That was the thing no other weapon in the American arsenal could do. And this was not a lucky night. Between December 15 and December 26 of 1964, the gunship flew 16 combat missions. All 16 succeeded, every single one. In the first 11 days of operations, the guns fired nearly 180,000 rounds in defense of those Delta outposts. Then came the demonstration that erased any remaining doubt. On February 8, 1965, a gunship arrived over a Viet Cong offensive near Bong Son. It did not fire a quick burst and leave, it stayed. For more than 4 hours it orbited that battlefield and poured fire into a hilltop position. By the time it was finished, it had fired around 20,500 rounds, and an estimated 300 enemy troops were dead. 4 hours, 1 aircraft, a single hilltop position broken apart by a converted cargo plane built in the Second World War. The Viet Cong, who had owned the darkness in that region for years, suddenly had nowhere in it to hide. News like that travels fast in a war. The commander of American air operations in Vietnam, General Joseph Moore, saw the results and did not hesitate. He asked for an entire squadron of these gunships. The idea that had been rejected for more than 20 years was now something the Air Force could not build fast enough. There was a small, telling fight over what to call it. The test aircraft had been designated the FC-47. That letter F in Air Force language stood for fighter, and the fighter pilots, the men who flew the fast, glamorous jets, were furious that a slow, ungainly, propeller-driven cargo plane was wearing the fighter letter. So in 1965 it was officially redesignated the AC-47, with the letter A standing for attack. The proud jetmen had lost the argument and won the letter. The Air Force began converting C-47 transports into gunships back in the United States and flying them across the Pacific. On November 14, 1965, the first full unit, the 4th Air Commando Squadron, arrived at Tan Son Nhut Air Base near Saigon. Its written mission was to answer night attacks on hamlets with flares and firepower, to help defend friendly forces, and to escort convoys. And this squadron carried the call sign that would become legend across South Vietnam. Spooky. The effect on the ground war went far beyond the raw count of enemy killed. It was psychological, on both sides. For the Viet Cong, the night was no longer a friend. Their own captured orders, as I mentioned, warned their fighters not to shoot at the dragon, because their weapons could not hurt it, and the tracers would only give away their position and draw its fire. Think about what that means. A guerrilla force that had built its entire war around dominating the darkness was now telling its own men to lie still and pray the dragon did not notice them. For the defenders, it was the opposite. For years, the sound of engines at night had meant a few minutes of light, and then abandonment. Now that same sound meant help was orbiting overhead and was not leaving. Green berets in isolated camps, South Vietnamese militia in tiny hamlets, all of them learned that if they could just hold out until Spooky arrived, they would live to see morning. By 1968, 2 full squadrons of these gunships were operating across South Vietnam, the 4th and the newly activated 3rd, flown, as one official account noted, by crews who were younger than the aircraft they were flying. Their work helped earn their parent wing a Presidential Unit citation. During the long siege of the Marine base at Khe Sanh in early 1968, gunships kept up steady fire and illumination through the nights. During the shock of the Tet Offensive that same year, they helped defend the airbase at Tan Son Nhut itself. The night, which the enemy had owned for years, now had a new owner, and it circled overhead breathing fire. Step back and look at the full record, because the numbers are hard to believe for a converted cargo plane from the 1940s. Over the course of the war, 53 C-47 transports were rebuilt into AC-47 gunships. 41 of them served in Vietnam. The aircraft flew an estimated 4,000 missions across South Vietnam and Laos. But here is the single statistic the crews were proudest of, the one that goes to the very heart of the problem we started with. According to combat reports, no village, hamlet, or outpost under the protection of a spooky gunship was ever overrun by the enemy. Not one. Somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 hamlets and outposts were defended by these aircraft over the years, and the people inside them held every time the Dragon was overhead. That is what taking back the night looked like, measured in the only way that mattered to the farmer in the village and the soldier in the camp. They survived. That record was not free, and honesty demands we count the other side of it. The gunship's great weakness, the one its critics had warned about from the beginning, was real. It was slow, low, unarmored, and it flew a predictable circle. As the war went on, and the enemy brought heavier and heavier anti-aircraft weapons to the battlefield, that weakness turned deadly. Of the 41 gunships that served in Vietnam, 19 were lost to all causes. 12 of them were lost in combat. Behind each of those losses were crewmen, young men in an old airplane, who kept flying that slow, deliberate orbit directly over the guns trying to kill them, because down below, someone was counting on the Dragon to come. One of those men gave us the most extraordinary single act of courage in the entire history of these aircraft. On the night of February 24, 1969, a 23-year-old airman first class named John Levitow was not even supposed to be on the mission. Levitow was a loadmaster. His job in the back of the gunship was to handle the flares, to set the timers that armed them, and to pass them to the gunner, who pulled the safety pin and threw them out the open cargo door. On this night, he was simply filling in for the regular loadmaster on an AC-47 with the call sign Spooky 71, flying with the 3rd Special Operations Squadron over the United States Army post at Long Binh, near Saigon. It was Levitow's 181st combat mission. The pilot, Major Kenneth Carpenter, spotted enemy fire below and threw the aircraft into a firing turn. In the back, Levitow set the timer on a flare and handed it to the gunner, Airman First Class Ellis Owen, who held it ready, his finger through the safety pin ring, waiting to toss it out. These flares were not small. Each was a metal tube about 3 feet long, weighing roughly 27 pounds, and once it ignited, it burned at around 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a small, portable furnace. At that moment, an enemy 82mm mortar shell struck the gunship's right wing and exploded inside the structure. The blast tore a hole more than 3 feet across in the wing and drove more than 3,500 fragments through the fuselage. Every man in the back was wounded and hurled to the floor. The plane lurched into a steep, partly uncontrolled turn. John Levitow took more than 40 pieces of shrapnel in his back and legs. He later said the concussion of the blast felt like being hit with a wooden plank. And in that chaos, the explosion had torn the armed, live flare out of the gunner's hands. It was now loose inside the cargo compartment, its timer running, rolling wildly across the floor as the wounded plane pitched and turned. It was surrounded by thousands of rounds of ammunition. When that flare ignited, at 4,000 degrees, inside that aircraft, everyone aboard would die. Levitow, bleeding from more than 40 wounds, barely able to feel his right leg, first dragged a badly hurt crewman away from the open cargo door so the man would not fall out. Then, he saw it, the smoking flare, rolling across the deck. He could not stand properly. He could not grab it as it rolled. So John Levitow threw his own body onto the burning flare. He pulled it beneath himself, held it against his own wounded body, and dragged himself, and it, across the cargo floor toward the open door. And he hurled it out. The flare cleared the aircraft and ignited an instant later, in open air, clear of the plane. Major Carpenter regained control and brought the shattered gunship down safely. When they counted the holes in the fuselage afterward, there were more than 3,500 of them. John Levitow survived. He recovered from his wounds, and then he went back and flew about 20 more combat missions before his tour ended. On May 14, 1970, President Richard Nixon placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. He was the first enlisted airman in the history of the United States Air Force to receive it. To this day, the highest honor given to the top graduate of Air Force enlisted leadership schools is named the John Levitow Award. He left the service and spent more than 20 years quietly working on behalf of fellow veterans, rarely seeking attention for what he had done. He died of cancer in the year 2000, at the age of 55, and he was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. That is who flew in the Dragon. Not gods. Young men in an old airplane, doing impossible things in the dark. Step back from that single night over Long Bin and look at what the whole story really means. The AC-47 did not win the Vietnam War, no single weapon did, and the war's outcome is its own long and painful story. But that is not the measure of this aircraft. The measure is this. For years, an entire strategy of insurgency rested on one foundation: the ownership of the night. Terrorize the countryside after dark, overrun the isolated and the weak, and disappear before the daylight and the jets arrived. It was working. It was slowly pulling the ground out from under South Vietnam, one hamlet at a time, and then a slow, plain 20-year-old cargo plane, carrying an idea that had been dismissed for over 2 decades, took that foundation away. Not with some exotic new technology, but by finally joining 2 old things that had been sitting side by side the whole time: the light and the gun. Once those were the same aircraft, the guerrilla's most reliable ally, the darkness itself, quietly changed sides. Every one of those thousands of hamlets that was never overrun stands for families who lived through a night they might not have survived. That is not an abstraction. That is the real human weight of a good idea that was very nearly never built. The story does not end in 1969 because the Dragon never truly died. It simply grew up. Even as the AC-47 was proving the concept, the Air Force was already building its successors, because the little gunship's limits in speed, power, and the weight of weapons it could carry were obvious. The last American AC-47 combat mission in Vietnam was flown on December 1, 1969. The surviving aircraft were handed to the air forces of South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and over the following decades, others would serve as far away as Colombia and El Salvador. But the bloodline continued. The AC-47 was replaced by the AC-130, known as Spectre, a gunship built on the far larger and more powerful C-130 Hercules, carrying not just miniguns but heavy cannon. It was joined by the AC-119, called Shadow and Stinger. The AC-130 in particular was judged roughly 3 times more effective than the old gunship, and it kept getting deadlier. That lineage runs unbroken to this very day. Across its successive versions, the AC-130 gunship has seen combat in Grenada, Panama, the Persian Gulf, Somalia, Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. The current version, the AC-130J Ghost Rider, flown by Air Force Special Operations Command, is one of the most heavily armed aircraft on the planet. It carries precision-guided munitions, a 30mm cannon, and a 105mm howitzer, the same caliber the Army fields as towed artillery, firing out the side of an aircraft, and it still fights the same way that First Puff did over Thanh Yen. It flies a pylon turn, it orbits the target, and it delivers continuous, precise fire for as long as the mission requires. In June of 2021, over Topeka, Kansas, the Air Force flew a restored AC-47 and a modern Ghost Rider in formation together, the grandfather and the grandson, wing to wing, decades apart, still built on the same simple, brilliant idea. Fly the circle, and never let the guns leave the target. What lingers about this story is not really the firepower, it is the waiting. An enemy who understood, better than his opponents did, that a war is not only fought with weapons but with time, and darkness, and patience. For years, that enemy held the most powerful military on earth to a standstill in the countryside every single night, not because the Americans lacked strength, but because their strength could not stay after sundown. The gunship's true achievement was that it finally gave the defenders something they had never had: endurance, the ability to remain. A guardian that did not run out of night before the enemy ran out of nerve. The people cowering in those hamlets never knew any of that history. They did not know about the pylon turn, or the grease pencil crosshairs, or the years of rejected proposals. They only knew that when the mortars started falling in the dark and the wire began to move, they could get on a radio and call, and that if they could hold on just a little longer, a sound would come out of the black sky, and the ground around them would turn to fire, and they would still be alive when the sun came up. The Viet Cong called that sound a dragon and told their men not to make it angry. The Americans called it spooky, and because of it, for the first time in that long war, the night did not belong to the enemy alone.